Every few decades, a drought does what no archaeologist grant could ever pay for. It turns off the water. Rivers drop, reservoirs pull back from their banks, and things that have been sitting underwater for 100 years or more come up for air. Georgia has had several of these events, and unlike the sinkhole and cave diver stories that circulate online, the things that actually surface are documented, visitable, and in most cases maintained by a historical society or state park that would love for you to come look at them. This is not a story about a hidden world. It is a story about a very real one, sitting exactly where the water left it, documented in deed books and church rolls and Army Corps project files, rather than in anything that needs a diver's flashlight to be believed. The state's worst drought of the 20th century hit in 1930 and 1931, right at the start of the Great Depression. It landed on top of decades of cotton farming that had already stripped topsoil off the Piedmont hills and dumped it into the rivers below, so badly that at least one old mill dam on the Flint River was buried entirely under silt runoff and has never been recovered. The drought didn't invent Georgia's mill pond problem, it just made it visible, the way every low-water year since has kept doing. Farmers watched their creeks shrink to trickles. Millers, who had already shut down decades earlier, saw their old raceways go dry enough to walk. The state would spend the rest of the 1930s building terraces, planting kudzu, and setting up soil conservation districts to slow the bleeding, but the damage to the rivers was already done, and in some places it is still visible on a map today. Before hydroelectric dams and rural electrification, nearly every Georgia community with moving water had a grist mill, a sawmill, or eventually a textile mill sitting on a small impoundment. Hundreds of these ponds and dams were built between the 1790s and the early 1900s. Most of the mills themselves are gone, burned, or collapsed. The stone and brick foundations, raceways, and dam walls are often still there, sitting right at the waterline, waiting for a dry summer to expose more of themselves than usual. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Scull Shoals, between Athens and Augusta on the Oconee River, is one of the best examples still standing in the open. It was a full mill village by the early 1800s, with a store, a warehouse, and a paper mill, and pieces of an 1809 toll bridge that the 1887 flood tore apart. A granite support beam from that bridge is still sitting in the river today, exactly where it landed nearly 140 years ago. The site is unmarked in detail, so visitors mostly have to match old maps to piles of brick and stone scattered through the woods, which is part of what makes it feel less like a museum and more like something you are allowed to actually find for yourself. Sope Creek, closer to Atlanta in Cobb County, tells a similar story. A paper mill and a flour mill there both burned in the same fire in 1867 and were never fully rebuilt. The ruins were significant enough to earn a spot on the National Register of Historic Places in 1973, and a 1922 hydroelectric dam on the same creek was already inoperable by the time historians surveyed the site. What is left is a scatter of brick and stone walls climbing the creek bank, some of it right at water level, some of it visible only when the creek runs low. Banning Mills, southwest of Atlanta on Snake Creek, took stone cutting a step further. Workers blasted rock directly out of the gorge wall to build the foundation and raceway for a paper mill that opened in 1867, and the exposed stonework along the Creek View Trail runs right along the historic raceway. Thousands of rock blocks came out of that gorge, and a good number of them are still holding the same shape they were cut into a century and a half ago, sitting in the creek exactly where the builders left them. Not far from Sweetwater Creek, another ruin tells a harder story. The New Manchester Manufacturing Company built a 5-story water-powered textile mill in 1849, and it stood until 1864, when Union cavalry burned it during the Atlanta campaign and marched the mill's women workers north as prisoners of war, a chapter of the Civil War that rarely makes it into the tourist brochures but is documented in the mill's own state park history today. The brick shell of that mill still stands, roofless, along the creek, one of the most photographed ruins in Georgia, and one of the bluntest reminders that not every mill town simply closed down. Some were deliberately destroyed. Columbus, Georgia, offers the clearest case of what happens when a river is deliberately lowered rather than left to a drought, and it produced one of the more satisfying corrections to a piece of local folklore in the state. The Chattahoochee drops more than 100 feet through Columbus as it crosses the fall line from the Piedmont into the coastal plain, which made the stretch through downtown one of the most heavily dammed short runs of river in the South. A grist mill first went up there in 1828 under a state land grant to Seaborn Jones, and by the 20th century the site, known as City Mills, had gone through a wooden dam, then an 1871 dam, and finally a stone masonry dam completed in 1907 by the Hardaway Company after 250 labourers worked through a dry autumn once the summer's rains and high water had finally let up enough to build. A short distance upstream, the Eagle and Phoenix Dam had powered a major textile mill since 1882. Both dams stood for over a century, until the city of Columbus decided to breach them in 2012 and 2013, restoring a natural flow to the river in order to build an urban whitewater course, a project that required archaeologists to document the riverbed before construction crews moved in. What they found behind the 1907 stone dam at City Mills was not a single structure but a stack of them, a surviving section of the 1871 wooden dam still largely intact where the crews had left it in place, along with smaller remnants of the original 1828 and an 1839 dam, the older wooden dam having followed the natural rock ledges in the riverbed rather than running straight across it the way the later stone dam did. The survey team also spent months tracking down a much livelier piece of local legend, the story that gamblers from Phoenix City's notorious mid-century vice district had tossed slot machines off the 14th Street Bridge to beat a police raid. Despite a thorough search of the newly exposed riverbed, they never turned up a single slot machine or even a fragment of one, a small but useful reminder that not every good river story from this stretch of the Chattahoochee turns out to be literally true, even when the water really was pulled back far enough to check. None of these sites needed a drought to be found. They are documented in county histories, historical society files, and National Register nominations. What a drought does is pull the water back far enough to show the parts that are usually hidden: the base of a dam wall, a submerged section of raceway, a foundation course that sits a foot underwater in a normal year. The bigger and stranger story in Georgia is not drought exposing old mill dams. It is the 20th century dams that buried entire towns on purpose, and the way drought years occasionally give those towns back, if only for a season. The clearest case is Etowah, a Bartow County ironworking town built up by Mark Anthony Cooper in the 1840s around a blast furnace, a rolling mill, a flour mill, and close to 1,200 residents at its peak. The town had its own post office, a Baptist church, a school, a bank and boarding houses, and its steam locomotive, the Yonah, even played a role in the Civil War's Great Locomotive Chase in 1862. Cooper sold his ironworks to the Confederate government in 1863 for $400,000 in Confederate bonds, against the advice of his own banker, a decision he later defended by saying he was not willing to speculate on the misfortunes of the country. The bonds became worthless within 2 years. So in a much more literal sense, did the town. Union troops under General Schofield burned Etowah's mills and factories in May of 1864, and the town was never rebuilt. Roughly 85 years later, in 1949 and 1950, the Army Corps of Engineers finished Allatoona Dam, and the resulting reservoir put what remained of Etowah underwater for good. Only one structure was deliberately left standing above the waterline: Cooper's stone blast furnace, still visible today just below the dam at what is now called Cooper's Furnace Day Use Area. It stands as the single marker for a town that disappeared twice, first to war and then to water, and it is one of the few places in Georgia where you can stand on dry ground and look directly at the last visible piece of a place that used to have 2,000 people living around it. Further north, the Coosawhattie River Valley held Kusa, a creek settlement of enough significance that some accounts describe it as a capital, before the Army Corps of Engineers built Carter's Dam in the 1970s and created Carter's Lake, the deepest reservoir in Georgia. The valley had already been shaped for centuries by Cherokee and Creek settlement along the river, before the dam went in, and the reservoir behind it now sits over ground that carried that history for far longer than it carried a hydroelectric plant. In a smaller and more recent case, the drought of 2007 to 2008 briefly resurfaced an old bridge at another North Georgia reservoir, giving locals a look at a structure that normally sits 30 feet or more below the surface, gone again within a season once the rains came back. Unlike Etowah, Kusa was never marked with so much as a single monument before the water closed over it, a contrast that says less about which history mattered and more about which one happened to have a wealthy 19th century ironmaster attached to it. The clearest recent proof that Georgia's droughts still do this work came in 2007, when the state fell into the worst dry spell on record for the region, worse by some measures than anything since the Dust Bowl of the 1930s that had already scarred the Piedmont's rivers with runoff. Rainfall around Gainesville, on the shore of Lake Lanier, totaled only about 20 inches for the year, and the lake began losing more than 2 feet of water a month by late summer. On November 22, 2007, Lanier dropped to a new record low of just over 1,052 feet above sea level, breaking a mark that had stood since a 1981 drought, and by late December the reservoir had settled even lower, more than 20 feet below its normal full pool. Governor Sonny Perdue stood on the steps of the state capitol that fall and led a public prayer service asking for rain, a moment that made national news and captured just how seriously Georgia was taking a shortage most residents had never experienced firsthand. What the falling water left behind at Lanier was not folklore. Boat docks across the lake came to rest directly on exposed rock and bare lake bed instead of floating on open water. A stretch of the old Georgia Highway 53, submerged since the lake filled in the 1950s, reappeared out of the drying mud, along with the pilings of a bridge nobody had thought about in decades. Near Gainesville, drought conditions exposed the remains of the old Gainesville Speedway, a dirt track where stock cars had once raced before the valley went under. Fishermen walking the newly dry shoreline found concrete foundations sitting incongruously in open fields of cracked mud, the kind of neatly placed blocks that only make sense once you remember a house or a barn used to stand exactly there. None of it required a diver or a locked archive. It only required the lake to keep shrinking through one of the driest years the Southeast had ever recorded, and for people to walk out onto ground that had not been dry since Eisenhower was president. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. These are not legends passed down by word of mouth alone. They are recorded in Army Corps of Engineers project histories, county historical societies, and in at least one case, a full biography of Cooper's life and ironworks written decades after his death. The pattern across all of them is consistent. Rural industrial towns, built around water power, were sacrificed later for hydroelectric capacity or flood control, with the old structures either burned first by war or simply left standing when the water came in behind a new dam. Not every submerged Georgia town fits neatly into that pattern, and one of them is worth slowing down for, because the popular version of its story has drifted from what the record actually shows. Lake Lanier, north of Atlanta, was built by the Army Corps of Engineers between 1950 and 1957 by damming the Chattahoochee River at Buford, and its waters did cover the site of a small community called Oscarville in Forsyth County. Online retellings often describe Oscarville as a black town that was flooded to erase it, drawing a straight line from a violent 1912 expulsion of black residents from Forsyth County to the lake's construction 4.5 decades later. Historians at the Atlanta History Center have gone back through the record and found a more complicated picture. Oscarville itself was a predominantly white town. What actually happened in 1912 was a county-wide campaign of violence and forced removal that drove more than 1,000 black residents, many of whom had been landowners and tenant farmers since Reconstruction, out of Forsyth County entirely, following the unproven accusation of a black man in the death of a white woman. Forsyth County remained almost entirely white for decades afterward, a fact still visible in its census numbers today. The lake itself was built for an entirely separate reason, nearly half a century later, to control flooding on the Chattahoochee and supply water and power to a growing Atlanta. Cemeteries, home foundations, and roads did go under the water when the reservoir filled, the same as at Etowah, but the flooding was not itself the mechanism of the 1912 expulsion. The two are connected by geography and by the same underlying history of racial violence in North Georgia, but conflating them, treating the dam as the instrument of the original crime, erases the fact that the true events were worse in a different way than the popular version suggests. An entire community expelled by name, in daylight, decades before a single shovel of dirt was moved for the dam. The real history here does not need a haunted lake framing to be worth telling. It needs to be told accurately. South Carolina has its own version of this story on a much larger and stranger scale. Lake Jocassee, in the Blue Ridge foothills near the North Carolina line, was created by Duke Power in 1973 by damming 4 mountain rivers and flooding the Jocassee Valley, a rural area that had supported farms, summer camps, and mountain lodges since the late 1800s. One of those lodges, the Attakulla Lodge, named for the Cherokee leader Attakulla, was a 3-story bed and breakfast built in 1898 that had operated continuously for more than 50 years before the valley was condemned. Its owner won a restraining order in court to keep Duke Power from bulldozing the property outright, so when the valley filled with water over 2 years in the early 1970s, the lodge was simply left standing where it was. It sat undiscovered and unexplored for 3 decades, until 2004, when technical divers finally located it, roughly 300 feet down, near the mouth of the Whitewater River, and found that the force of the rising water had knocked the building over onto its side. Reaching it today requires advanced decompression diving in complete darkness and water that holds steady in the mid-40s, with divers getting only about 15 minutes at depth before a 2-hour ascent broken by mandatory decompression stops every 10 feet. Not far from the lodge, on what was once dry pasture land, sits the relocated Mount Carmel Baptist Church Cemetery, the same cemetery that appears briefly in the 1972 film Deliverance, its headstones still legible to divers even though the remains themselves were moved to higher ground before the valley flooded. Jocassee was never a secret, and Duke Power did not hide what was going under the water. Families who had lived in the valley for generations were paid, in some cases inadequately by their own account, and relocated before the dam went in. What survives now is simply what nobody thought worth the cost of demolishing, preserved by cold, clear, still water, instead of by any deliberate act of memory. Not every drainage event in the southeast is a drought or a planned reservoir. Small farm ponds and old mill ponds sometimes fail entirely on their own, when a dam gives way after heavy rain rather than a dry spell, and a 1988 geographical survey out of Kennesaw State University documented several of these across the Georgia and South Carolina Piedmont. Dyer Pond in the Oconee River Basin near Athens, and Railroad Pond near Aiken, South Carolina, both drained almost completely between one field visit and the next after their dams broke, dropping thousands of cubic meters of water in a matter of hours. A separate storm on Millstone Creek in Oglethorpe County, near the site of the old Eccles Mill, produced a flash flood in September of 1987, serious enough to be documented by name and rainfall total in the same survey, more than 3 inches falling on the headwaters in a single day. These are smaller and quieter versions of the same basic fact that runs through every story in this piece. A great deal of the southeastern landscape is water sitting behind human-built barriers, some of them 2 centuries old and forgotten, some of them poured in living memory, and when those barriers move, whether by drought, flood, or simple age, the land underneath tells you plainly what was there before the pond existed. There is a related and more official thread here too, one that shows how this kind of discovery usually happens on purpose rather than by accident. In Warren County, west of Augusta, a site called Mill Branch needed a new reservoir to keep a kaolin processing operation running through dry periods, since the clay industry there depends on a steady water supply that ordinary creeks cannot guarantee during a drought. Because building that reservoir required a federal permit from the Army Corps of Engineers, it also required a cultural resource impact study first, standard practice under environmental law, long before a single acre was flooded. That fairly ordinary industrial drought-proofing project ended up generating a real archaeological survey of the Briar Creek watershed, the kind of quiet, procedural fieldwork that never makes it into a viral video, but is exactly how most genuine discoveries about the region's past actually happen. Somebody was required to look before the water rose, and so somebody looked. Tennessee has the single clearest case of a drought actually giving a drowned town back, and it happened well within living memory. Norris Dam, the Tennessee Valley Authority's first major project, was finished in 1936 on the Clinch River, and the reservoir behind it swallowed a small farming community called Loyston, first settled around 1800, and home to roughly 70 residents and 25 families by the time the TVA came through. Loyston had a general store, a school, a post office, and a Methodist church anchored by the old May Spring Farm and Mill, and its residents were relocated to Knox, Anderson, Blount, and Loudoun counties, whether they wanted to leave or not, a pattern repeated across more than 1 million acres and thousands of families as the TVA built out its chain of dams through the Depression and the Second World War. Loyston's valley became the widest part of Norris Lake, a section still known today as the Loyston Sea. For 20 years, that was the end of the story. Then, in the mid-1950s, a severe regional drought, combined with unprecedented power demand, forced the TVA to draw Norris Lake down further than it ever had before, and Loyston came back. Newspapers at the time described crowds arriving at a rate of thousands of cars an hour to walk over ground that had been underwater for 2 decades. The old highway to the neighboring town of Andersonville reappeared with its state road signs still standing. Foundations, a bridge that led nowhere, a school foundation, and the shell of the old post office all sat exposed in the drained lake bed, along with the rusted husks of cars residents had abandoned when they left. It was, by the account of at least one reporter on the scene, the most dramatic drawdown in the history of the TVA system, and it happened for the same reason Georgia's 1930-31 drought mattered, not because anyone went looking for a lost town, but because a shortage of rain and a strained power grid did the work of exposing it without anyone's permission. Norris Lake was not the only Tennessee reservoir built over a community with its own name and its own history. Cherokee Lake, further east on the Holston River, submerged the tavern at Bean Station, an inn built in 1814 along the first road connecting Knoxville to the nation's capital, a stop so central to early Tennessee travel that nearly every important figure of the era is said to have spent a night there before it went under. Percy Priest Lake, closer to Nashville, covers the community of Couchville, relocated in the 1960s, where part of the old main road is still said to rest on the lake bottom beneath a recreation area that now carries the town's name instead of the town itself. None of these were secrets kept from the public. The TVA documented Loyston extensively before it flooded the valley, commissioning photographs and sociological surveys of the community, specifically because officials understood they were erasing a place that would otherwise vanish from the record entirely. That documentation is exactly why the drought drawdown of the 1950s could confirm what the archive already said. Reporters and residents walking the exposed lake bed were not discovering an unknown town. They were checking the paperwork against the ground, and the ground matched. The same 19th century farming practices that filled Georgia's rivers with silt and buried that one Flint River mill dam for good also produced the state's strangest inversion of this whole pattern, a place where the land itself, rather than a river, disappeared. In Stewart County, in the southwest corner of the state, Farmers cleared native forest from rolling hills in the early 1800s and planted cotton on slopes with no thought given to erosion, ploughing straight up and down the grade rather than along the contour. By 1850, ditches 3 to 5 feet deep had already cut into the fields. Farmers largely ignored them until the gullies had grown too deep to stop, eventually reaching depths of 150 feet and swallowing farms, a schoolhouse, and a church building whole. What remains today is Providence Canyon, sometimes called Georgia's Little Grand Canyon, a network of brilliantly colored gorges that formed in under a century where cotton fields used to be. In the 1930s, around the same years as the state's worst drought, local boosters tried to have Providence Canyon protected as a national park by insisting it was a natural wonder, while soil scientists and conservationists were simultaneously holding it up nationally as the clearest possible proof of what careless farming does to southern land. Both were right about the aftermath and wrong about the cause. It is a canyon, and it is unmistakably scenic, and it exists entirely because of the same soil-stripping agriculture that filled the state's mill ponds with sediment and forced the creation of the soil conservation districts that followed the 1930-31 drought. Georgia's rivers were not the only thing that decades' farming practices reshaped. Sometimes the land itself just came apart. It would be easy to dress all of this up. Georgia and South Carolina have genuinely lost towns underwater, genuinely have stonework older than the region's electrical grid still sitting in their rivers, and genuinely had droughts severe enough to reshape agricultural policy for decades afterward. None of that needs an invented diver, a fabricated lab report, or a compression strength number pulled out of nowhere to feel significant. It also does not need its real tragedies simplified into a tidier, spookier shape than what actually happened, the way the Oscarville story sometimes gets flattened for a better ghost story hook. The true version, expulsion by mob violence in 1912, and an unrelated dam built for water supply in the 1950s, is harder to tell in 30 seconds, but it is the version that respects the people it happened to. What is actually interesting about Scull Shoals, or Cooper's Furnace, or the Attakulla Lodge sitting on its side 300 feet down in Jocassee, is not a mystery waiting to be solved. It is the plain fact that a large share of the Southeast's 19th and 20th century past is sitting exactly where it was left, half in the water and half out, with no conspiracy required to explain why nobody moved it. Some of it burned in a war. Some of it was drowned on purpose to keep the lights on in Atlanta or Charlotte. Some of it silted over because the hills upstream had no topsoil left to hold, a slow-motion burial that took decades rather than a single flood. A courtroom order kept one lodge standing long enough for the water to simply cover it whole. The historical societies, state parks, and Corps of Engineers offices that maintain markers and day-use areas at these sites are not hiding anything. In most cases, going back through old newspapers, court records, and family accounts is the only reason the fuller story survived at all, corrections and all. If you want to see any of this yourself without a dive certification, Scull Shoals, Sope Creek, the Sweetwater Creek Mill ruins, Banning Mills, and Cooper's Furnace are all publicly accessible, several of them inside state parks or Corps of Engineers land, with marked trails leading right up to the stonework. Lake Jocassee's underwater sites are reserved for experienced technical divers only, given the depth and the decompression risk involved. But the valley's history is well documented on shore for anyone who wants the story without the dive. None of it requires you to take anyone's word for a mystery. It is sitting there, in most cases with a historical marker standing a few feet away, waiting on the next dry summer or the next diver, with enough line on the reel to go looking. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.